Okay, for decades, the world lived on a knife's edge. You had two global superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, locked in the Cold War. It was this intense rivalry with two completely opposite ways of seeing the world, and the whole planet lived under the constant shadow of nuclear war. So, how did they suddenly step back from the brink?
I mean, that's the central puzzle we're tackling today, right? How did two mortal enemies, with enough firepower to literally end civilization, just start talking? What could possibly make them pull back? Well, the answer is a fascinating and really important period in history we call Détente.
But to really get why they chose to talk, first, we have to understand just how terrifying the alternative was. We need to get our heads around the crazy logic of this whole standoff.
They had a perfect acronym for it. MAD, Mutually Assured Destruction. And this wasn't just some academic theory. It was the chilling, everyday reality of the Cold War. Both the USA and the USSR had so many nuclear weapons they could vaporize each other many, many times over. So the only thing stopping you from launching a first strike was the absolute certainty that you would be wiped out in the retaliation. There was no winning a nuclear war. It was just mutual suicide.
And this all came terrifyingly close to happening. In 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis wasn't some theoretical exercise. For 13 days, the entire world held its breath as things threatened to spiral completely out of control. It was a massive wake-up call for both President Kennedy and the Soviet leader Khrushchev. It showed them that even if they didn't want a war, one could happen almost by accident. The threat of MAD had just become horrifyingly real.
And just look at how fast things were escalating. This timeline is wild. As soon as one side developed some new, terrifying weapon, like an ICBM in '57, the other side rushed to match it, usually within a year. From missiles launched from submarines to systems designed to shoot down other missiles, this constant, expensive, and incredibly dangerous game of one-upmanship was just pushing both nations closer and closer to the edge.
So by the late 1960s, this constant tension was just becoming unsustainable. Something had to give. And as it turned out, a pretty unique set of pressures began pushing both superpowers down a very different path.
And crucially, it wasn't just one thing. It was like a perfect storm of four major factors all hitting at once. You had the constant, nagging fear of nuclear Armageddon, you had a super costly and unpopular war, you had serious money troubles for both sides, and, to top it all off, a massive, game-changing shift in the communist world.
For the United States, Vietnam was a huge turning point. It wasn't just the insane financial drain, draining billions of dollars. The war was becoming deeply, deeply unpopular at home. The human cost was fueling massive anti-war protests all over the country, and that created enormous political pressure to find a way out.
And these numbers, they really tell a devastating story. I mean, just look at the peak years of 1968 and '69. Over 24,000 American soldiers were killed. This wasn't some abstract conflict happening on the other side of the world. Its cost was being felt in towns and cities all across America. So, when Richard Nixon became president, you better believe ending this war was his #1 priority.
And it wasn't just the US feeling the financial pinch. This arms race was incredibly expensive for both sides. While America needed money to deal with social problems at home, the Soviet Union's entire state-run economy was just creaking under the strain. They desperately needed to move money away from building more weapons and towards just making life better for their own people.
So, right in the middle of all this pressure, a massive opportunity suddenly appeared. A crack had formed in the very foundation of the communist world, and it was about to change the entire game of global diplomacy.
Now this was a seismic shift. For years, the US had viewed communism as this single, unified force, like a giant monolith. But now, thanks to some pretty bitter ideological differences and even border disputes, the Soviet Union and China were rivals. They couldn't stand each other. This just shattered that old worldview.
And who saw this opportunity? Well, enter the key architects of America's new foreign policy. President Richard Nixon, a famous anti-communist, and his brilliant, and I mean brilliant, National Security Advisor, Henry Kissinger. These guys weren't sentimental. They were pragmatists who saw the world like a giant chessboard, and they saw a path to checkmate. Their strategy was called triangular diplomacy, and honestly, it was genius in its simplicity. Here's the play. By opening up a relationship with China, the US could suddenly put a ton of pressure on the Soviet Union. The Soviets, terrified of a US-China alliance against them, would suddenly be much more willing to come to the negotiating table.
The US could now be the pivot point, playing the two feuding communist giants off each other.
And let me tell you, Nixon and Kissinger did not waste any time putting this plan into action. The year 1972 would see this whirlwind of diplomacy that fundamentally redrew the entire map of the Cold War.
I mean, just think about how stunning this was at the time. In February, you have Nixon, this famous anti-communist, in Beijing, shaking hands with Mao Zedong. Then, just 3 months later, he's in Moscow meeting with the Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev. Brezhnev knew he had to host Nixon because he absolutely could not afford to be left out in the cold while the US and China were suddenly getting friendly.
And this quote, from a document signed right there during that Moscow summit, it just says it all. For the very first time, both sides were officially saying, hey, our different political systems shouldn't stop us from having a normal, stable relationship. They were agreeing to avoid military showdowns and prevent nuclear war. Ideology was finally taking a back seat to simple, practical survival.
So, what do we call this really remarkable period? All these pressures, all these diplomatic breakthroughs, they all came together in a policy that had a simple, kind of elegant name.
The word is détente. It's French for relaxation or easing, and that's exactly what it was. It was a deliberate easing of the incredibly high tensions that had defined the Cold War for more than 2 decades. It was a conscious choice to pick up the phone instead of picking a fight.
So, what did this actually look like in the real world? Well, it meant leaders like Nixon and Brezhnev actually started holding regular meetings. It meant strengthening that direct hotline between Washington and Moscow. And maybe most importantly, it led to the first ever treaties to actually limit nuclear weapons, like the SALT talks. It also opened the door for more trade and cooperation, all built on that shared goal of, well, not blowing each other up.
Now, détente wasn't the end of the Cold War. Not by a long shot, but it proves something really profound. That sometimes survival can be a more powerful motivator than ideology. It showed that even the most bitter enemies can choose dialogue over destruction when they're both staring into the same abyss. And I guess the question for us today is, do we have to get that close to the brink before we start talking?